Tioi with grave NBNOI dung chuan thun, a with circumflexem, ton trong emoti, koi van ban duwei, not the silence, did not break all at once. It thinned slowly, like ice cracking beneath weight no one wanted to acknowledge. Adrian Caldwell kept his posture straight, shoulders squared beneath the tailored navy jacket that cost more than most people earned in a month, yet his eyes did not leave Tessa. She had stepped out of her place, out of the neat, invisible lines drawn around staff and guests, and now she stood in the center of a world that was never meant to include her. The woman in the gray coat lowered her hand, fingers trembling, but she did not retreat. Up close, the guests could see that her hair, once blonde, had faded to a pale silver, and there was a faint scar along her left wrist, thin and deliberate, like a line drawn years ago. "You need to explain yourself," Adrian said quietly, his voice controlled but edged with something sharper than irritation. The breeze off the sound tugged at the edge of the white event tent, carrying the scent of salt and polished wood. Tessa inhaled once, steadying herself. She could feel 100 eyes on her, could feel the weight of judgment before she had even spoken. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Hartford, watching her mother scrub hospital floors through double shifts, learning early that speaking out of turn had consequences. But she had also learned that silence could cost more. 3 weeks ago, she began carefully, I was assigned to inventory the lower storage rooms before the winter gala. The archive cabinet in the east wing was jammed. The lock was broken. Adrian's brow tightened slightly. He did not remember authorizing anyone to access those files. Tessa continued anyway. There was a banker's box inside, dated October 1989. It was labeled Private Adoption Records. A faint murmur moved through the guests like wind through dry leaves. The woman's breathing grew shallow, as though each word Tessa spoke pressed against her ribs. Adrian felt the familiar instinct to shut it down, to redirect, to restore order. "That is confidential," he said evenly. "And irrelevant." Tessa met his gaze. She did not look defiant. She looked certain. Inside that box was a hospital intake form from St. Mary's Medical Center in Boston. It listed, a newborn male, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, born at 2:14 in the morning. There was a note about a birthmark on his right shoulder blade, crescent-shaped. The world seemed to narrow around Adrian's spine. The music had stopped completely now. Even the caterers stood still. The woman lifted her eyes to him again, and this time there was no confusion in them, only quiet recognition. Adrian's hand drifted unconsciously toward his shoulder, toward a mark he had carried his entire life. One he had been told was meaningless. The night air felt cooler suddenly, heavier. "Those records were sealed," Adrian said, though the firmness in his voice had thinned. "They were not supposed to be seen." "I know," Tessa replied softly, "but some truths are not meant to stay buried in a basement." The woman swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "I never stopped looking for you." And for the first time in years, Adrian Caldwell felt the ground of certainty shift beneath polished Italian leather shoes. Tioi with grave NBNOI dung chuan thun, a with circumflexem ton tun, BNOI dung chuan thun, a with circumflexem, ton. The bracelet caught the light, like a quiet accusation. Adrian did not reach for it at first. He only stared, as though the thin strip of gold weighed more than the empire he had built. The engraving was small, almost worn smooth, but the word was still visible. Hope. He remembered tracing that word as a child, asking where it came from. He had been told it was symbolic. A gift from a charitable program. Nothing more. The woman's hands trembled as she held it out, not demanding, not pleading, simply offering it back to the life it had been taken from. "They let me hold you for 12 minutes, she said softly. 12 minutes, and then they said it was time. They said you would have opportunities one could never give." Adrian swallowed. 12 minutes. He had measured time in earnings calls, in quarterly growth, in 5-year projections. He had never considered that the first 12 minutes of his life might belong to someone else's memory entirely. The breeze lifted the edges of the event tent again, carrying distant traffic from the main road, and the faint echo of the ocean tide beyond the property line. It felt unreal that the world continued as usual while his understanding unraveled. "You said there was a payment," he said to Tessa without looking at her. "How much?" His voice was steady, but it had lost its command. Tessa hesitated. $200,000, she answered carefully. "Transferred within 48 hours of your birth." A low murmur moved through the remaining guests. $200,000 in 1989 was not a donation. It was a decision. Adrian felt heat rise beneath his collar despite the chill. His adoptive father had always spoken of generosity, of creating futures. But generosity had never felt transactional. I did not know, Adrian said quietly, almost to himself. It was not a defense. It was a realization. The woman's eyes softened. I never believed you did, she replied. That is why I came to you. Not to shame you. Not to ruin your night. I came because I needed you to know that you were loved before you were adopted. You were not abandoned. You were negotiated. The word landed heavier than any accusation. Negotiated. Around them, the staff stood frozen in professional uncertainty. No one moved to intervene. No one dared to speak. Tessa felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. The truth was no longer fragile. It was visible. Adrian finally extended his hand and took the bracelet. His fingers brushed the cool metal, and for a moment he closed his eyes. He could see the hospital corridor in his mind, though he had never consciously remembered it. White walls. Fluorescent lights. A door closing. Why did you not fight it? He asked, not harshly, but with the raw curiosity of a child. The woman's voice trembled. Because I was told that if I did, you would end up in the system. And I had seen what that did to children. Adrian opened his eyes again. The estate lights still glowed perfectly, but something inside him had dimmed and brightened at the same time. The story he had lived by was no longer complete. And for the first time since he had taken over the Caldwell Foundation, he understood that wealth could build hospitals and wings and plaques in gold letters, but it could not rewrite the first 12 minutes of a life. The lawn no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a confession booth under open sky. Adrian stood with the bracelet resting in his palm, the thin gold curve catching the light from the string lamps overhead. The crowd had thinned to a respectful distance now, donors retreating toward the edges of the estate, their whispered conversations dissolving into the hum of the autumn night. The violinist quietly lowered her instrument. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a car passed on the coastal road, its headlights sweeping briefly across the iron gates before disappearing. Adrian drew a slow breath, the kind that filled his lungs completely, as though he were bracing for cold water. If what you are saying is true, he said, his voice lower than before, then my entire foundation was built on a version of the story that was incomplete. He did not sound angry. He sounded thoughtful. The woman studied his face carefully, as if memorizing it again after decades. I did not come here to destroy what you built, she replied. I came because I could not carry the silence anymore. Tessa felt the words settle into her chest. Silence had weight. She knew that from her own life, from watching her mother endure remarks and assumptions without protest, because rent was due and jobs were fragile. She had stepped forward tonight because she recognized the look in the woman's eyes. It was the look of someone erased. Adrian turned slightly, glancing at the mansion behind him, its tall windows glowing warm against the darkening sky. He had spent years restoring that house, preserving every architectural detail from the original 1920s design. He valued legacy. He valued history. Yet he had never questioned his own. Why did you wait until now to bring the bracelet? He asked gently. The woman exhaled slowly. Because I was afraid you would look at me and see a threat instead of a mother, she said. I did not want to force myself into your life. I only wanted the truth to have a place in it. The wind lifted the edge of her coat again. Adrian noticed how thin the fabric was, how little protection it offered against the 50-degree air. Without announcing it, he slipped off his own tailored jacket and held it out. The gesture was small. It was quiet, but it shifted the space between them. She hesitated, then accepted it, the sleeves too long for her arms. Tessa watched carefully. This was not a public relations move. There were no cameras near enough now to capture it clearly. This was instinct. Adrian looked back at her. You should not lose your job for this, he said, his voice steadying. Tessa shook her head slightly. I did not speak to keep my job, she replied. I spoke because you deserve to know. The estate lights flickered softly as the generator adjusted to the cooling temperature. The evening had grown colder, but the tension had eased into something deeper, something reflective. Adrian glanced at the bracelet again, then at the woman wearing his jacket. For the first time in his carefully structured life, he was not calculating risk or return. He was considering connection. And in that quiet pause beneath the open Connecticut sky, The billionaire understood that some inheritances were not measured in assets, but encouraged to face the truth when it finally stands before you. The night had settled fully now, a deep blue stretching over the Caldwell estate. The last of the guests quietly departing in black sedans that rolled down the long gravel driveway without fanfare. The fundraiser had dissolved into something far more intimate, far more irreversible. Adrian stood only a few feet from the woman wearing his jacket, the gold bracelet still resting in his hand like a compass he had never known he needed. The staff lingered at a respectful distance, uncertain whether to resume their duties or witness what history might look like when it rewrites itself in real time. Tessa remained near the edge of the marble patio, her posture calm, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She did not step forward again. She had already done what she came to do. Adrian's gaze lifted from the bracelet to the woman's face. He studied the curve of her cheek, the shape of her eyes, the faint crease that deepened when she blinked back emotion. He searched for familiarity, for something that mirrored his own reflection in the dark glass of the mansion windows behind him. And then he saw it. Not in a dramatic flash, not in a cinematic revelation, but in a quiet alignment of expression. The same way his brow tightened when he was thinking. The same slight tilt of the head when listening closely. "What is your name?" he asked gently. She hesitated, as though the answer mattered more now than it had in decades. "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Lane." He repeated it, under his breath, testing how it felt. Margaret, a name he had never known belonged to the beginning of his story. The estate lights reflected softly in her eyes. "Did you ever give me a name?" he asked. Her lips trembled into a fragile smile. "I called you Daniel," she whispered. The name landed in the space between them like a door unlocking. Adrian inhaled slowly. Daniel. It did not erase Adrian Caldwell. It did not dismantle the man he had become, but it revealed a layer beneath him, something unpolished and human. The wind carried the faint scent of fallen leaves from the edge of the property. Somewhere inside the house, a clock chimed 9 times. Time had moved forward, yet the past had caught up in a single evening. Adrian stepped closer, not with dominance, not with hesitation, but with intention. "If I ask for proof," he said quietly, "will you come inside and show me everything you have?" Margaret nodded without pause. "I brought copies," she replied. "I have kept them safe for 33 years. Tessa watched the shift carefully. The tension that had once felt sharp and volatile had softened into something steady. Not certainty yet, but willingness. Adrian turned briefly toward her. "You opened a door tonight," he said, his voice even. "You did not have to." Tessa met his gaze. "Some doors are meant to be opened," she answered. There was no triumph in her tone, only conviction. Adrian looked back at Margaret, then toward the glowing entrance of the mansion that had always represented security and permanence. For the first time, he understood that permanence built on partial truth was fragile. "Come inside," he said at last, his voice no longer carrying the weight of authority alone, but something deeper. "Let us begin with honesty." And beneath the quiet Connecticut sky, the billionaire who once believed his life was fully written took the first step toward reading the pages that had been hidden from him since the very first 12 minutes. The foyer lights inside the mansion glowed warmer than the string lights outside, casting long reflections across the polished marble floor as Adrian led Margaret through the double doors. Few steps behind, not as staff now, but as witness. The security team lingered at the threshold before Adrian gave a subtle nod for them to stand down. The doors closed with a soft echo, sealing out the night and the last whispers of departing guests. Margaret paused just inside the entryway, her gaze lifting to the sweeping staircase and the oil portraits lining the walls. "I never imagined this," she murmured. "I only imagined you safe." Adrian gestured toward the study on the left, the room where contracts had been signed and foundations established. Tonight it would serve a different purpose. He motioned for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs near the fireplace, though no fire burned. The air inside was precisely 72 degrees, climate-controlled and steady. Margaret carefully unfolded a worn canvas envelope from beneath the jacket he had lent her. Her hands shook slightly as she spread the contents across the glass coffee table. Photocopies of hospital records. A faded photograph of a young woman holding a newborn wrapped in a pale blue blanket. A discharge form stamped with a date that matched Adrian's birthday exactly. Tessa stepped closer, her eyes scanning the documents she had only glimpsed briefly in the basement archive. Adrian leaned forward slowly, lowering himself into the chair opposite Margaret. He did not rush. He read each line deliberately, his finger tracing the hospital letterhead, the signatures, the amounts authorized for expedited placement. The language was clinical, detached. It did not acknowledge the human cost. "My father's signature," Adrian said quietly, recognizing the precise slant of the handwriting. There was no accusation in his voice now, only realization. Margaret nodded. "They told me he was a generous man," she said. "They told me he wanted a child more than anything." Adrian closed his eyes briefly. His adoptive father had been many things. Strategic, charismatic, determined. But this decision had been executed with the same efficiency he applied to business acquisitions. Tessa watched the shift in Adrian's posture. The rigidity that once defined him had softened into contemplation. He opened his eyes again and looked directly at Margaret. "I cannot change what was done," he said slowly. "But I can decide what happens now." Margaret's breath caught slightly. The house around them remained silent, as though even the walls understood the gravity of what was unfolding. Adrian reached across the table and gently gathered the documents into a neat stack. "You will not return to a shelter tonight," he said evenly. "You will stay here as my guest while we verify everything formally. I owe you that respect." Margaret's eyes filled, but she did not look overwhelmed. She looked relieved. Tessa felt warmth rise in her chest, not from triumph, but from witnessing a man choose humility over pride. Adrian turned toward her briefly. "And you," he said, his tone steady, "will no longer work unseen in this house." There was no elaboration yet, no grand announcement, just acknowledgement. Outside, the last car disappeared down the long driveway. Inside, beneath steady light and quiet resolve, a family history long buried beneath marble and legacy began to surface, not with chaos, but with deliberate truth. The house felt different after midnight. The marble floors reflected softer light now, no longer framed by donors or expectation, only by truth settling into quiet corners. Margaret sat near the fireplace in a guest robe provided by the house staff, her silver hair brushed back, her hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea that steamed gently in the still air. Adrian stood by the tall windows overlooking the dark lawn, the bracelet resting against his palm once more. Beyond the glass, the estate stretched 2 acres into shadow, immaculate and controlled, yet for the first time it did not feel like a fortress. It felt like a place waiting to be redefined. Tessa lingered near the doorway of the study, unsure whether to remain or excuse herself. She had spent 3 years moving silently through these rooms, polishing surfaces and straightening frames that displayed a legacy she had never been part of. Tonight she had stepped into that frame. Adrian turned from the window slowly. His posture was different now, less rigid, less rehearsed. "I spent my life believing I was chosen," he said quietly. "Believing my story began with generosity." He looked toward Margaret, then down at the bracelet. "Now I understand it began with sacrifice." Margaret's eyes filled again, but she did not speak. She did not need to. The weight of 33 years had already spoken for her. Adrian crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, not as a billionaire seeking approval, but as a man seeking alignment with his own beginning. The gesture was simple, unannounced, witnessed only by the quiet walls and one steady housekeeper who refused to remain invisible. "I cannot rewrite the past," he said gently, "but I can acknowledge it, and I can honor you moving forward." He reached for her hand carefully, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Margaret's fingers closed around his, fragile yet certain. The contact was brief, yet it bridged decades. Tessa felt her breath steady. There were no cameras, no applause, no headlines to capture this moment. Only stillness. Adrian rose again and turned toward her. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will begin the legal process to correct the record. Transparency, documentation, accountability." His tone carried conviction, but not dominance. "And you will not remain in a role that keeps you unseen." Tessa met his gaze calmly. "I did not ask for recognition," she replied softly. "I asked for truth." Adrian nodded once. "And you delivered it." The clock in the hallway chimed 12. Midnight. A new day beginning without spectacle. Margaret leaned back slightly, her shoulders easing for the first time since she stepped onto the lawn hours earlier. Adrian walked once more to the window and looked out over the dark estate, then at his faint reflection in the glass. He saw Adrian Caldwell. He saw Daniel. And for the first time, he did not feel divided between them. The house remained quiet, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees lining the driveway. Inside, three lives stood at the intersection of past and future, not defined by wealth or status, but by the courage to face what had been hidden. And in that stillness, beneath steady light and honest breath, the truth did not shatter the empire. It refined it.